Thanks so much, Richard, for that introduction, and it's great to see so many of you here. Thanks for coming. I wanted to start by introducing you to some queer folk and some queer places from 4 regional English cities in the 1960s. And we're going to work clockwise. So Lucia moved from Ireland to Manchester as a teenager in the early 1960s. In the factory where she found work, she heard about the pansies. I'm going to be doing a lot of this, just to warn you. She heard about the pansies who drank at the New Union on Canal Street, and along she went. I stood on Canal Street looking at these people going in and out, she said. I saw men dressed as women and vice versa. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. These punters became like Lucia's family, and she was taken under the wing of the straight landlord and landlady who found her bar work nearby and also a place to live. This sense of family really mattered because of attacks by queer bashers and particularly intense police activity in Manchester in the 1960s and 70s and indeed beyond. We had to take care of ourselves, she said, and as our numbers got bigger, we got bolder, and we would step out of the New Union onto Canal Street with our drinks. And we had queens at each end guarding us. They were vicious against the homophobes, she said. In a 1969 expose, there we go again, of the Leeds queer pub, the Hope and Anchor, and you can see that the Hope and Anchor is just tucked on the right there, of the Leeds queer pub, the Hope and Anchor, readers of the national scandal rag, The People, were introduced to Jane, who worked in a local mill, where she arrived and left early before everyone else because people would ridicule her so much at work. At the Hope and Anchor, other punters told the People that she gets most hurt if not referred to as her and she, but found it generally to be a place where, as she said herself, she could enjoy herself without feeling out of place. Like Lucia, she found a sense of family here. 2 weeks after the People's report, the Hope and Anchor pub was ransacked by Leeds and Glasgow Rangers football fans, and it closed, leaving Jane and others without their anchor point for a year before it reopened as the New Penny, or the Bent Penny, as it became known locally. In interviews recalling the pub in its new incarnation, so from sort of 1970-ish, several men said they would rarely or never go there. John remarked, everything would be straight back to work. Your job would be untenable. He and others had too much to lose. Others had too little to gain. Ruth remarked on how male-dominated this pub was, and the couple of others also nearby. She came from Wakefield to find like-minded people one night, but returned home disappointed. Eileen moved to Brighton from Glasgow because of its near queer notoriety in the 1960s, or by the 1960s. She relished being able to go out on a Sunday wearing a pair of slacks and, quotes, nobody turned around calling me a cow. Ted from Southampton felt euphoric when he moved here in the 1960s. I just dived in and I never looked back, he said. One of the several pubs that Ted enjoyed was the Golden Fleece, which had 2 bars with very distinct atmospheres. Bert in one was the soul of discretion. Dennis in the other was one of those flamboyant queens. His bar was hilarious and riotous, but Dennis could be indiscreet and might compromise you in public. Discretion still clearly mattered in Britain's San Francisco. Nearby Filkin's Casuals, the smutty combination of Phil and Ken, the men who owned it, meanwhile fed a distinctive queer style in Brighton in the 60s and 70s, with terribly Hawaiian shirts and all sorts of twirl at the neck, Grant remembered. Remembering 1960s Plymouth, this is there in the bottom left, from the vantage point of the 2010s, local-born Ted, a different Ted, there's quite a lot of Teds, was nostalgic. It was better when it was against the law, he said. We were like a big family. We all knew who we were and where we could go. We always used to go for drinks on Saturday night at the Lockyer Hotel, which is pictured here. The queer bit was this lower level extension at the back. It was only a little place, but we were used to it, and the staff knew us. Another local, a teenager in the 60s, was forbidden by his parents from going down Union Street, notorious for the sailors who went out on the lash there. He went, nevertheless, of course, and remembers the Paramount. You got up to this tall, really tacky room with a tacky bar where they played jukebox music. And you got all the services. You got the prostitutes, you got the queer boys. Basically, the dregs of society ended up there. And sometimes you'd get a drunken sailor saying, "Come here, darling, I want to dance with you." The imperative, though, was to keep below the proverbial radar. You have your joke, you muck about, but nothing else, one Lockyer punter told Gay News when they visited in the early 1970s. Now, there's... Oh. There we go. Now, there's much to connect these places and experiences. In each, there was at least one tacitly queer pub. Brighton had several, which had a mix of punters who found some sense of ease and possibility, quite a lot of fun, and for some, a sense of family in what were, in other ways and in other places, hard times. These were years when the homosexual-heterosexual binary, with which we're now so familiar, was becoming more entrenched and discussed. And in each city, this separation was becoming more evident, in a way illustrated in this documentary on Leeds, which I'm just going to show you a small clip of. Let's see if we can... Oh, no. I'm either going to show it you, I may not be able to show you this. Let's have a look. No. Oh, don't know where my tech is. Oh, there we go.
Although in Leeds, as in other cities, most people do not adopt Victorian moral attitude and even express a kind of tolerance, it is still difficult for a homosexual to fit into the tougher and less permissive environment that he finds there. Some homosexuals have their own places, which they must stick to. Others have nowhere.
Are there any Leeds, do you know?
I don't know, but I feel like it was Australia, but they all keep their own little house.
Well, very spoken and notorious. I went down to Copenhagen for a giggle. Oh, yeah. And why did I giggle? No, it was thinking actually.
Oh, that was funny, but okay. Probably wouldn't laugh at that.
I don't mind it. I feel more simple than else.
Well, I'm from Manchester. I was a student in Leeds. When we first came up there, I went on this pub crawl with a couple of students to see what places were like. It's very big pub, you know. Went to a few pubs. And some of these pubs were filled with queers, teddy boys or queers. And some of them try, some are not. We don't really mind it as long as you're not bothered and not stare so much. But then some of the students at the university, in charge of the Union News, do these articles on Leeds, so I do want homosexuality. And the whole bank is known to everybody in Leeds, I think, as far as I know. And he went there and took some photographs. And the queers there just to play up to it, so it seems like doing antics, dancing on tables, stripping up. I think one of the photographs was off in shirt, which you don't do normally, you know, these are obviously some play on students. And then later on, one of the Sunday scandal sheets, must have found the story, a good story. They came on and started and did a double spend, quite lurid story, I believe. And Leeds are playing football team, Rangers, Glasgow Rangers. And Leeds is pretty bad anyway for football, people smashing windows. I think the Rangers lost, and they were being on a pub crawl afterwards. And they must have come across this place or heard it in this paper anyway. And went there probably thinking the Mick, a bit boozed up, you know. And of course, some trouble finding it. Place was closed down.
It was quite an interesting, I think, vivid image of Leeds at that time. But what I think is particularly interesting about this short clip from this film is the way in which we don't get to meet any homosexuals that they talk about so much. This is about people who are over there in their haunts, and we're getting this from very much from the perspective of the norm. What the film also suggests is a real sense of real and present danger. I was really struck when I was looking again at this film and just thinking about what it must have been like to be in the Hope and Anchor that night when the Rangers and Leeds fans descended and started fighting and destroying, ransacking the pub to the extent that it had to close down. I mean, a terrifying experience. And this sense of real and present danger was again present in each city to varying degrees. And this is perhaps no surprise, because arrests and prosecutions for homosexuality continued across the 1960s. And in fact, after the 1967 Act, which partially decriminalised homosexuality, arrests increased. Men and women continued to lose their jobs if their sexuality was revealed, and women also lost their children in distressing custody battles. Trans folk appear in the press infrequently in the 1960s, but when they do, it's usually to do with reports of suicide and attack. So we can generalize, I think, between these cities and nationally about queer experience in the 1960s and beyond. And these threads of connection are very important. But in this lecture, I want to think a bit further about what marks out these cities and these folk, and so make an argument that the particular dimensions of locality, the local geography, economy, politics, size, history, and also distance from London, make a real difference to the identities and communities which formed and were experienced in each of these places. If we just go back to our cast of characters, we might glimpse something of this. So we might spot Lucia and her friend's defiance. We might see Ted's caution and also nostalgia in Plymouth. We can see the sense of embattlement in Leeds city centre. And we can see, too, the sense of possibility and scope for some visibility, flamboyant or otherwise, for Eileen, the other Ted, and their circles in Brighton. Communities, scenes, and identities had a different cadence in each of these places because of particular circumstances and inflections of local, regional, national, ethnic, and other identifications. If the call to come out was soon to be articulated loudly, nationally, and internationally in the early 1970s, it was taken up very unevenly in each of these cities. And so by looking at each of these cities in turn, 2 in the north, 2 on the south coast, but all within the English jurisdiction, I'm going to pull out the factors that I think have made for these differences. In doing so, I want to suggest the significance of thinking about sexuality in particular and local contexts, and suggest the need to be suspicious of sweeping accounts which often place London front and centre, and assume that its history can also count as a national history. There are our cities. 2 up the top, 2 at the bottom there. So if we start with Manchester, the largest of our 4 cities, but in decline in the 1960s as the manufacturing base shrank and a programme of slum clearance took hold. 544,000 people lived in the city in 1971, a drop of 80,000 from 1961, really quite a substantial dip. The population fell by a further 90,000 by 1981, before gradually recovering to roughly the 1971 figure by 2021, under very different economic conditions. The wider Greater Manchester region, meanwhile, maintained a more consistent population of 2.7 million, including some of those who had left the central parts of the city. Others moved in, however. Afro-Caribbean immigrants settled in the inner south suburbs from the later 1950s, and the number of students in the city doubled from about 12,000 to about 24,000 from 1961 to 1971, and that's kind of in line with the national trend. These incomers contributed to a burgeoning youth culture in the city, which was centred on dance halls, shebeens, and all-night cafes, which were, according to the Bolton Evening News, hives of moral decadence. A somewhat associated queer scene developed alongside, brought to wider visibility during the 60s by particularly aggressive policing, which came with the appointment of John Mackay as the new chief of police in 1959. Landlords and punters at the Rembrandt, a country pub in the city, and the more working-class New Union, which we've seen already, both on Canal Street in the southern part of the city centre, found themselves in court on various indecency and licensing charges. These and other venues were mapped in local press coverage as a result, flagging the existence of a nascent queer scene as surely as the dangers associated with it. It showed you where you could go if you were interested. The intense police activity and press interest in part explains the stridency of queer community here that we saw in Lucia's testimony. The formation of the Northwestern Homosexual Law Reform Committee, later the CHE, the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, was founded here in the mid-1960s. You can see that on the right on the left-hand side there. And direct action lesbian and gay organising at the start of the 1970s, in a campaign of kiss-ins and slogan painting on city central railway bridges, for example, has been understood locally as an extension of the city's longer radical lineage of Peterloo and the Pankhursts. So said Paul Fairweather, Manchester City Council's first gay officer from 1984, and another radical local initiative. Paul suggested that this Mancunian history and tradition, together with union and workplace comradeship, underpinned a particular sense of solidarity and an upstart queer scene in Manchester, large enough to have lots going on, but unlike London, small enough to be socially and politically networked and completely manageable. I'm quoting Paul here. So we've got a combination of factors. A city large enough to have a critical mass of queer people, particularly intense police activity, marshalled against queer and black people and the venues they used from 1959 right through to the 1980s, a broader tradition and history of solidarity and radicalism, and an interestingly and enduring crossover queer scene which brought different people together. So in the 60s, but also into the 70s and 80s, there were central Manchester venues like Paddy's Goose, Tommy Duck's and the Blooms Hotel, which were nominally regular bars, but popular with queer and trans people. If I went to the Goose on a Wednesday, I'd be sure to find some other trans people to spend the evening with, said Jenny Ann, who felt anchored in the city in the 70s and 80s as a result of these places, and also because of a trans support group running out of the university chaplaincy on Oxford Road, crucially with a car park that allowed her to arrive and also to leave discreetly and safely. In the years to come, these traditions continued. Manchester remained on the cutting edge politically. It hosted the largest anti-Clause 28 demo in the country in 1988, and you can see that up here on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. Apologies, left and right, always tricky. And the city also gained a larger national and international reputation for its cutting-edge and crossover music and dance scenes. In a city in decline, it was cheap in the 1970s and 1980s to live and to put on parties in the industrial buildings and warehouses that were increasingly lying empty in the centre. Kate, a trans woman, told me in an interview, the only people who seemed to live in town in the late 1980s were queer. We didn't even have a supermarket. There was something about not just moving to Manchester, but living in the centre of it. We just wanted to be right in it, to be part of it. The Labour-controlled City Council was amongst the first in the country to appoint lesbian and gay officers, as we've seen already, and committees in the 1980s, mid-1980s. And the council actively supported the new gay centre. It helped gays and lesbians into housing, recognising the disproportionate difficulties many of them faced, especially in the context of the AIDS crisis. And they helped facilitate the formation of the UK's first gay village through licensing and street furniture and other initiatives. And this happened in the deserted warehouses and buildings around Canal Street, the post-industrial landscape lending itself to this kind of renewal. In the early 1980s, the area around Canal Street was still, and I'm quoting, full of cotton workers by day and prostitutes by night, according to the former landlord of the Rembrandt. Thereafter, The warehouses emptied, and only the prostitutes were left. In 1990, etched out of an old building on Canal Street, the glass-fronted Mantos opened as the first of the new-style bars modelled on those in Paris and Barcelona around the same time to introduce, said one of the owners, a bit more sophistication to the scene. Though interestingly, punters initially crowded upstairs to avoid being in full view. The risk of exposure was still very real for many. Soon after, this area became the hub for city centre warehouse apartment living, bar and club-based socialising, and AIDS-related community fundraising and support. The new potential of the Pink Pound was especially evident here. And Queer as Folk, the landmark Channel 4 series of 2001, cemented the village's place on a queer cutting edge for a much wider audience, and the City Tourist Office was soon promoting it alongside Curry Mile and other newly defined urban quarters. Cerridwen from Leeds found it liberating, exciting to have such a place, where there was at least a couple of lesbian venues and nights alongside the majority that were gay male. Joe contrasted the bright lights of gay Manchester with parochial Plymouth. The village was criticised for being an exclusionary ghetto, for being too commercial, too young, too white, too straight, too gay, for not being queer enough. And partly as a result, it provided a spur to an alternative in the 2000s, associated especially with the Northern Quarter and harking back to earlier music, queer and drag scenes. This alternative scene traded frequently on ideas of local working class, industrial and radical authenticity, rather than the Euro-American trends which were seen to dominate the village scene and venues. It pushed boundaries in terms of music, performance, and what it meant to be queer, the more frequently deployed term in this alternative circuit. The gay village, nevertheless, maintained its status as a place of socialising, community, remembrance. Opposite the Canal Street, there's a park called Sackville Park, which has a memorial to Alan Turing, to people that died in the AIDS crisis, and to people who have suffered transphobic attack and murder. The bars and clubs of Canal Street, etched out of former industrial buildings, were and are still busy and are a tourist draw. So if Manchester became, by the 1980s and 1990s, queerly notorious, Brighton was ahead of the game. Already by the 1950s, courting the pink tourist pound and described by one late 1960s journalist as the gayest place in Europe, and visibly so. Brighton and Hove together had, in 1971, 230,000 residents. It was a really compact, or is a really compact, city, hemmed in by the South Downs on the one side and the sea on the other. The population densities were high, with flats and bedsits close to the centre and to the social scenes. The local economy was consistently reliant on sole traders rather than big employers. Hotels, cafes and shops provided what Alan Berube described as classic low-paid queer work, militating against the ethic of solidarity extending from the workplace we see in Manchester, whilst also fostering an individualism which I suggest was Brighton's hallmark. Only 21% of Brighton and Hove's population worked in manufacturing in 1971, 10% below the national average and 20% lower than Manchester, and this declined further over the period. More people here were self-employed and in professional, managerial and skilled roles, with a substantial proportion, 1 in 20 in 1971, 1 in 12 by 2011, commuting the 60 miles to office-based jobs in London. Such work, these office-based jobs, opened out possibilities for women in particular to have lifestyles independent of family, as Alison Oram has argued. Commuting separated work from home, sexual and social lives for many Brightonians, further underpinning the onus on pleasure and consumption in the city itself. So the keynote I'm highlighting was self-expression and individualism, and this was enhanced by an arts and students scene which had a disproportionate impact here because of the small size and geography of the city. The University of Sussex, in the middle there, opened in 1961, rapidly gaining a radical reputation. And alongside, there were new town centre buildings for the College of Arts and Crafts. The Brighton Festival began in 1967 and rapidly became the biggest arts festival in England. A queerish independent bookshop, the Unicorn, opened much earlier here than in the other cities. And there were also avowedly gay hotels earlier than in other parts of the country. We can see that the proprietor of the New Steen Hotel, which had been around, I think, since the late 60s. This was, moreover, in the 1960s and until the early 1990s, a relatively cheap place to live, certainly not now. And this made for a youthful and countercultural population. An associated queer life was tangibly woven into Brighton's cultural and commercial fabric. And this was a draw to a steady stream of migrants from other parts of the country in decades when homophobia was felt acutely elsewhere. Surveys in the mid-1990s show very few members of the LGBTQ population were actually born in the city, and this is a rather different profile from in Plymouth, for example. And there was a sense of this, of a city enthusiastically chosen, and again by individuals and for themselves. You can see a theme emerging here. And though Brighton remained very white, the incomers furnished some sense of cosmopolitanism and brought different experiences and ideas to bear on the community and sense of counterculture here. The queer scene was already substantial enough by the 1960s to be riven by cliques and snobbery. Grant recalled that lots of queers would say, "Oh, I wouldn't go into that place, it's frightfully rough and tumble." His own queer set went out during the week to avoid the rougher queer blokes from Midland and northern cities who he said visited at weekends. There was a distinctive style too, as we've already seen. Michael found the quick-witted Brighton Queens very alarming when he arrived from Luton in 1960 as a 22-year-old, and Grant remembered that colour-wise in Brighton, it was a bit grotesque. There was a fashion link between Brighton and London, and much shuttling to and from the capital in ways that gave this smallish seaside resort a metropolitan edge. By the 70s, there was clear links between hippie, feminist, left-wing and queer people and causes, helping make Brighton, to Jim, possibly one of the easiest places in the country to come to terms with an alternative from mainstream identity. This was certainly political. But the sense of queer ease and possibility in Brighton in these years partly explains why it wasn't urgently political. Certainly in comparison to Manchester and Leeds, where gays and lesbians were facing especially heavy-handed policing on the one hand, and on the other, open, violent hostility from the National Front. So there's a real different cadence, texture to queer life in Brighton as opposed to those two other cities. Strikingly, queer folk in Brighton were behaving before 1967 as if what they were doing was legal. And in that sense, the Act made relatively little difference here. Clause 28, when it came in 1988, was a different matter, especially in the context of the AIDS crisis, which hit Brighton so especially hard, consolidating networks and communities of care. Clause 28 banned the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities, and this was a particular affront in Brighton, which had a reputation, as we've seen, as a town of historic queer ease and visibility. The particular fervent activist upsurge in Brighton in the late 80s and 90s thus springs from this 80s moment, from Clause 28, and gave community here a new texture. As opposed to Manchester, the council was cautious and did not celebrate and market the city's queer credentials until the late 90s and 2000s. Activism and community was instead determinedly grassroots and often mobilised in opposition to this council. An interview in Plymouth described going to Brighton and realising you could be gay there, an identity he didn't associate with his home city. Devastated by the air bombardment of 1941, Plymouth was remodelled in the post-war years as a self-consciously modern city, albeit with historic seafaring roots. Its centre in that reorganisation was depopulated, and reconstructed suburbs were zoned for supposedly more convivial family living. You were much less likely here than in Brighton to have a central bedsit a couple of doors down from a queer bar. This reconfiguration was apparently something of a draw. The population grew by 35,000 across the 1960s, reaching 239,000 in 1971, more or less the same as Brighton, but much less densely packed. The city's culture and reputation still revolved around the navy and the docks. In the 1960s, a full 40% of men, 11% above the national average, worked in public service of one type or another, largely on account of the military presence. 25,000 people were employed directly in the dockyard or navy in the 1970s, and roughly the same again in associated trades. This amounted to just under a quarter of the city's working population. More people here than nationally were skilled and semi-skilled, with fewer in the professional and managerial or unskilled social categories. As a result, many Plymouthians shared a class and occupational background and identity, often aligned with a strong sense of family tradition and culture. It was, like Brighton, also very white. Interviewees in Plymouth repeatedly emphasised the work and family networks of gossip and their concern with what the neighbours might think. There was a felt need to keep below the proverbial radar, and for very pressing reasons. Homosexuality was outlawed in the armed forces until 2000 for both men and women, affecting not only those directly serving, but their partners and families. If in Brighton, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act was an irrelevance because people were already living as if what they were doing was legal, here, the 1967 Act was an irrelevance because there was another national ordinance which had a particular impact on this military city. The military presence and its significance to the local economy meant there was only a negligible peace movement here. Neither was there much of an anti-racist or feminist movement in this overwhelmingly white and traditional city. The arts scene was small, and the student population didn't expand until much, much later, the late 90s. Now, these things matter because they are factors that prompted and sustained the alternative scenes, politics, and countercultures which feature in different ways in each of the other cities, especially from the late 1960s, and which aligned gay, lesbian, and trans identities closely to the left and to counterculture in this period. In Plymouth, we see something very different, but it did not mitigate against queer fun here. There was a big, I'm quoting, a big scene for women in the early 1980s around the station, Sharon told me. She remembered that we used to designate loads of little pubs around North Road. Everyone would kind of gather on, say, a Thursday night, so the landlord would know we'd all descend on whatever night it was. This scene was, however, fairly invisible unless you knew women who were part of it. When Prudence and Gay moved here from Manchester in 1982 to set up the In Other Words bookshop, which is there in the middle, they also established a local lesbian line because of what they identified as the local ignorance of where to go for advice and for friendship with other lesbians. The couple themselves brought a certain Mancunianism with them, and because they ran their own business and didn't have local family to worry about, could afford to be more overt than many queer people in the city. In other words, was remembered by several as a daringly prominent hub. It was almost like an alternative reality, said Alan. I was living in Plymouth, and I was living in the traditional Plymouth, but there were these little pockets of places, like In Other Words, that I could access if I felt brave enough. Then there was the Lockyer until 1977, 2 years after Bell Cook did this wonderful rendering of its interior. 1977, when the new landlord turfed out the gays, and one or two other pubs or clubs and more loosely queer venues like the Paramount, which Michael described earlier. There was an equally vibrant outdoor sex scene in the city's many green spaces, involving men, including a sizable number of sailors, who often didn't identify as gay, but enjoyed casual sex with other men. There seems to have been a tacit knowledge and toleration of this. There was a sense here in the 60s and really right up until the 1980s that you could retain your normality and your masculinity whilst also having some casual gay sex, as long as you didn't act gay. At a workshop I ran in the city, a story surfaced of a father who beat up his son really quite seriously in the early 1980s when he discovered that this son was gay, despite the fact that he himself, the father, had regular casual sex with men. In this military, male-dominated city, there was an especially thin dividing line between the sex men might have with each other and homosexual identities taken up by others, which were deemed to be beyond the pale. Such lines were sometimes policed by the kind of terrible violence that this father meted out to his son. The imperative was to discretion, and this was facilitated by the separation of homes in Plymouth from places of social and sexual recreation. There was, as a result, no real pushback in Plymouth against Clause 28, partly because there was little impetus to be visible in the first place. What's especially interesting about Plymouth is the nostalgia I mentioned earlier, and which we see especially vividly in Dennis's testimony. Dennis came to Plymouth as a trainee submariner in the 1970s, early 1970s, and came out as gay and left his marriage in the early 2000s. When I was a junior rating, he said, in the 1970s, I shared a cabin with 3 guys, and so we had that community feeling of you look after one another. It was normally a case of a group of us going to Union Street. You go out together, you enjoy together, you're entertained, and you take it from there. And I think that's lost now, because everyone is an individual. They go back to their room, and they shut their door. They just live on their own. The places, the pubs, the bars, they were probably frequented by sailors, be they gay, be they straight, or what have you. It's gone. At the Swallow, the only remaining gay bar in Plymouth, where 95% of the people were LGBTQ, Dennis said he didn't feel comfortable amid people doing their own thing, being flamboyant, being garish, being loud. The greater visibility of LGBT people in the 2000s had not led to a greater feeling of community for Dennis. Like those serving in the Navy in these later years, people at the Swallow were just doing their own thing. By the time I interviewed Dennis, the culture here around sexual pleasure was anchored more firmly in identity, as it had been in Brighton since the 60s at least. With a single gay bar and a receding public sex scene, Plymouth had less to offer the casually interested, or indeed those who identified as gay or lesbian. If there was a drive to reinvent a scene in Manchester and Leeds at this time, there was little of that here. There was not the critical mass, and several interviews referred to a local apathy and an enduring reluctance to put your head above the parapet. Kevin describes friends who went annually to Pride in Manchester to be gay. I'm quoting. They have 4 or 5 days to be drunk, to dance, they have World AIDS Day remembrance, and then they come back to normal life down here. With a population of 750,000, so we're on to final city, city number 4, Leeds, Leeds was 3 times the size of Brighton and Hove and Plymouth, and was in addition well networked by road and rail with nearby Bradford, Wakefield, Huddersfield, and Halifax, offering multiple opportunities for socialising, activism and sex. It had some of the same traditions of labour and working class solidarity as Manchester. It was similar too in terms of students and associated youth, counter and activist cultures. But queer life and community was also distinct here, marked by the later 70s by separatism and also a social scene oriented away from the centre. I signalled at the outset the edginess and male dominance of this part of Leeds in the 60s, 70s and also 80s. Ajamu from Huddersfield meanwhile described a particular discomfort here. In the 1980s, he said, you had rock shots, you had the New Penny, and then there was a pub not far away called the Whip. And the Whip was a National Front pub. And then also, because some of the gay bars were still also predominantly white, there's a sense of your new meat. So a lot of black folks would not go into town. In Chapel Town, even though you weren't out, you were kind of safe. Chapeltown was an inner northern suburb known for Afro-Caribbean immigration, and also streets with large houses lending themselves to communal squatting and, often subsequently, management by housing cooperatives. This is the area where Ajamu, who identified then as bisexual, socialised in shebeens and reggae clubs, and also domestically. For a specifically gay scene, he would cross the Pennines to Manchester, rather than going into the centre of Leeds a couple of miles away or a mile away. The large houses, meanwhile, enabled a lesbian, feminist, and separatist community to form, and also to be sustained, with a social scene developing in rooms rented in local pubs, the Dock Green, which I rather like, was a former police station, you can see it pictured there, and also in an Afro-Caribbean community centre in Bradford. There wasn't the appetite or resource amongst these women to establish city centre bars at a moment when the scene there was in decline and widely seen as unwelcoming to women. There was some sense of solidarity between the black and lesbian communities because of the particularly active neo-fascist groups in the city. The National Front was something that brought a lot of people together in opposition, said Yvonne. Really, the only people who supported our community was the black community, and the only people who supported them were us. And so a very close link developed in the 70s, ad hoc, not official, she said. When gay pride was switched from London to Huddersfield at the last minute in 1981 to protest against escalating police activity against gay men in what had previously been a fairly convivial queer hub, marchers in Huddersfield travelled into nearby Leeds after the march to join the 20,000 people gathered in Hare Hill's Potters Newton Park for the Northern Carnival against racism. And this is a repeated theme of the 70s and 80s, this interconnectedness of politics, activism, and counterculture. The particular separatist politics in Leeds was partly to do with the early emergence of the women's liberation movement here from its inception in 1969. But it was also fired and consolidated in anger at the horrific murders by Peter Sutcliffe, the so-called Yorkshire Ripper, between 1975 and 1981, and at the misogyny which laced the press and police response. Women against violence against women were especially active here, as was the Reclaim the Night movement. By the late 70s, there were all-women working collectives, art and theatre projects, and also early self-insemination networks aided by a local anti-sexist men's group, not gay men's group. There was thus a strong sense in inner North Leeds of a distinct lesbian counterculture and community, which was transformative for many, if alienating for some others. What's also clear in Leeds is the ways the suburbs and satellite towns came to matter queerly in the 70s and 80s, much more than the edgy centre. This began to shift in the late 1980s, when lesbian-initiated action against Clause 28 drew gay men to the kind of joint campaigning that had waned here in the early 70s. Ceridwen remembers walking with men for the first time. We were talking about joint efforts about being lesbian and gay. This was new, it was scary. There was also much more mixed socialising from the late 80s, including at the biannual Victoria costume balls, which were huge events, significant not just in their scale, said Ceridwen, but because they were with men. The area around the New Penny was meanwhile beginning to gentrify. City centre living was becoming generally fashionable again, and new and converted warehouse apartments in this area near the station appealed especially to those who were travelling to and from London for work, as Leeds developed from a centre of manufacture to a hub for legal and financial services. The new bars reflected the by now established LGBT identitarianism, but sex and desire were still not only understood and experienced in these terms here. When the AIDS and sexual health charity MESMAC was established in this part of the city in 1990, it served deliberately men who had sex with men, an approach that had been rejected in Brighton, where campaigning was directed very specifically at gay men. In ethnically and culturally diverse Leeds, it was more common than in Brighton for men to have sex with each other without claiming an associated, distinctive or exclusive sexual identity, rather as in Plymouth earlier. Messaging targeting gay men may thus have missed its mark. A sense of this expansiveness and diversity was fostered at nearby Wharf Street Chambers, nearby to Mesmac headquarters, an anti-capitalist workers' cooperative which began operating in 2012 in a disused hosiery factory. Again, the post-industrial landscape offering some queer potential. Social and support groups met here, and it gained a particular reputation as a welcoming space for trans and gender non-binary people who had previously often felt the need to travel or move from Leeds for community, notably to Manchester, where there were longer-standing networks and a different, if still uneven, tradition of inclusivity. This central part of Leeds became a queer hub again, and there was a sense of return in this, even though the shape and dimensions of community had shifted dramatically since the days of the Hope and Anchor in the 1960s. In the years in between, Leeds' queer life flourished, mostly beyond this part of the city, in the suburbs and satellite towns, and through social and political networks converging in community centres, the upstairs rooms of regular venues, and people's homes. The scene was always underground in Leeds, said Ajamu, and as a result, for people like Colin from Plymouth, if you said a gay city, Leeds certainly wouldn't have come to mind at all. This was to do with geography and demographics, with alternative social, sexual, and political scenes, and with a local authority which was supportive, but less proactively so than in Manchester. As a result, industrial decline played out differently on queer life here. So let me conclude. In the 70s and 80s, Pride was definitively, apart from that trip to Huddersfield, a London event. Now, there's barely a weekend between June and September without a Pride event in one city or another across the UK, including Manchester, Leeds, Brighton and Plymouth, which held its first Pride later than the other cities in 2010, and typically for Plymouth out of public view in the city, inside the City Hall. This fanning out of Pride from the capital in the 1990s, but especially the 2000s, speaks to shared queer coordinates and trajectories. These relate to shifts in understandings and experiences of identity and community, to changing attitudes and patterns of socializing, to the internet and the inception of smartphones, to legal change, and to processes of industrial decline and urban regeneration. We can point also to broad economic and occupational shifts towards the service sector, which had an impact on queer scenes and flagged the new potential of the pink pound. Deindustrialization meant that in some cities there were vacant buildings ripe for queer conversion. This was part of a process of gentrification which made city centre living and socialising fashionable once again, especially for those who were single or child-free. Some celebrated these shifts. Others saw a homogenising, commodification, commercialisation, and a loss of a radical edge. There was, though, much unevenness in this process. The result, I've suggested, of very particular local circumstances. The tenor of local government, the scale and fervour of local LGBTQ and intersecting politics, the activities of the police and neo-fascist groups, and then the particularity of local geography, demography and history modulated the way wider trends, wider national, international trends, played out on local queer life. Hence, although pride as a feeling has been wrapped into queer identification since the 1970s, it has had a different cadence in each of these different places. In Plymouth, there was a long-standing pride in passing. In Manchester, a twisting together of gay and civic pride. In Leeds, a transformative feminist pride and politics. And in Brighton, a pride in self-expression, camp visibility, and in being, as the council now proudly announces, never normal. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Matt, thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. We do have some time for questions. So if you're in the hall with a question, please wave at Safi, and Safi will deliver the microphone to you. And in the meantime, I've got a number of questions on Slido as well. Any questions in the hall to start us off with?
Thank you, that was excellent. I'm thinking about the contemporary vitriol and rhetoric levelled at trans people. I'm wondering how much you think that is a bit of history repeating itself with some of the homophobia faced by the citizens of the 20th century.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, no, I think there's two things about history. I mean, the first is that there's a very strong sense of being there before. I mean, I came out in 1990, and the late 80s and early 90s, the kind of homophobia and the particular rhetoric about danger to children and these various other, and pretense and all these various, strands of homophobic rhetoric are getting remobilized against trans people in the present, and surprise, surprise, in the run-up also to a general election. But I suppose what I'd add to that, maybe in a way that I think gives us maybe some hope, is that I think the emergence and flourishing of trans historical work, of trans history, and queer historical work that includes work on trans people and networks, I think it really gives the lie to the current transphobic rhetoric that being gender non-binary is something new and modish. So I think this kind of deeper history and the particular ways in which trans identities and communities have formed in different places across the UK is a really important part of the histories that we're trying to mobilise. And it goes back to that kind of 70s insistence that history is personal and history is political. So this is why these histories matter, because if we don't make these histories, then the transphobes, the homophobes get away with this presumption, this insistence that these identities and communities are somehow only of the present.
Cool. I'll take one from Slido next. You've talked about 4 very different places across England. What do you think those places, the cultures of those places, had in common over the period you've been looking at?
So, in a way, what they have in common actually is, I mean, I think you can really look at each decade and you can identify some common features. I mean, I talked about there was a real resonance with some of these kind of queer-ish, I've called them, pubs, where there was a real crossover of people gathering, and it was kind of more or less the only place in the city where you might go socialise. And so you can see, factors like that. I think you can also see, a commonality in terms of music cultures, some performance cultures. I think there's that sense from the kind of 2000s of smartphones and the internet kind of maybe homogenizing in some ways queer culture. And yet I'm a bit resistant to these commonalities. I think that it's not to deny them at all. But I think what we start to miss is, for example, the very particular impacts of the AIDS crisis, for example, on certain parts of certain cities and certain places in the UK as opposed to others, and the different levels of fear and community coming together in those different contexts. And I think we can also see, there's a kind of tangible difference between the kind of 2 northern scenes of Leeds and Manchester, for example, for all the reasons I've talked about, as well as things that make them alike. And there's a kind of considerable crossover as well. I suppose, if I was going to call it, I'd say that the biggest commonalities are between Manchester, Leeds and Brighton. I think they were all fascinating in different ways, but for me the most fascinating city was Plymouth. I mean, it was our kind of wildcard case study, and it really threw up a very different dynamic. And it threw up this kind of really interesting nostalgia. So we tend to think about this, trajectory where, it was all terrible and now we're here and the laws change and everything's much better, supposedly. But in Plymouth, there was a real nostalgia for a very different form of community, a very different form of coming together for both lesbians and gay men in the city. And I thought there was something really interesting about that, and that really informed the way in which community and identity were understood in the present as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Any questions in the room before I take another one from Slido?
Hi, thank you so much. Would you speculate on what the future of queer England could look like, given the ties that you brought up between economy and military hubs in the city and things like that, as the country's changing with the cost of living crisis? What do you think the future of queer England could look like as people are moving differently and living in different places?
That's a really wonderful and unanswerable question. But no, it's very interesting to reflect upon. And in a way, one of the reasons why I think we talk about the growing homogeneity of queer cultures is partly because of economic change. So actually the distinctive economy of Plymouth, for example, and of Manchester and of Leeds has shifted. And there's much more in common between those three economies than there was even 20 years ago. And that really makes a difference. I'm not an economic historian, but I became convinced working on this project that the work people do and the economies of local people really matter to the way in which they think about themselves. And so I think, in a way, you could talk about a kind of movement towards the service sector re-inflecting and homogenizing queer culture into the future. So I suppose that's one thing to reflect upon. The other thing that I think is really notable, you'll have spotted maybe that I talked a bit about house prices in Manchester and Brighton. And I think one of the things that is going to happen increasingly is a greater spread of queer individuals and a community that's networked over larger areas. Because Brighton, it was really interesting stroke sad in Brighton to interview older LGBTQ people who felt priced out of a city that they'd lived in for 30 years and were moving along the coast, some of them to places where they'd started out and left because of the homophobic attacks and abuse they'd received there. And I think I think you're seeing the same in Manchester, kind of spread out from the city. And I wonder whether we're going to see, also as social attitudes change unevenly, I wonder whether we're going to see a greater spread and the significance of online networks connecting people. And I think that might be something to kind of reflect on, maybe my retirement project in 10 years' time.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a terrific evening of some fascinating insights, not just into queer culture, but into a wonderful reminder of the fact that the history of England and the history of Great Britain isn't just the history of London, but it's the history of the whole country. Please join me in thanking our speaker this evening, Professor Matt Cook.
Thank you.
That's terrific.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.